He didn't knock. He didn't wait to be introduced. Walter Gaines pushed open the mahogany doors of the 40th floor boardroom of Arcturus Capital, walked past 12 men in suits whose combined net worth exceeded the GDP of a small nation, and sat down in the empty chair at the end of the table. The chair they'd left empty, out of habit, the chair that had belonged to the company's founder. The room went so quiet, you could hear the city 40 floors below. And then Walter reached into the pocket of his janitor's uniform. The uniform with the Arcturus logo stitched above the breast pocket. The same logo on the building's letterhead. The same logo on the documents sitting in front of every board member, and he placed a single envelope on the table. 12 men went pale. Because they knew what was in it. They'd spent 4 years trying to make sure this moment never happened. It was happening anyway. 17 years before that morning, Walter Gaines was not a janitor. He was 34 years old, and he was the chief technology officer of a company called Helix Systems, a cybersecurity firm he had built from a 2-bedroom apartment in Baltimore, with $40,000 in savings, a second-hand server rack, and a mind for systems architecture that his professors at Howard University had called, without exaggeration, once in a generation. Helix Systems designed infrastructure protection software for financial institutions. By 2007, it was protecting 11 of the country's 20 largest banks. Revenue, $68 million. Staff, 212 people. Walter Gaines owned 51% of the company he'd created. The other 49% was distributed among early investors, including a venture capital fund called Arcturus Capital, run by a man named Douglas Hale. Was the kind of man who made rooms rearrange themselves around him. 61 years old, silver-haired, old money Connecticut by origin but self-fashioned as a meritocrat. A man who'd built Arcturus from a family inheritance into a $2 billion private equity operation through what he called discipline, and what his former partners called root. He collected companies the way other men collected art, for their value, for their status, and with a very clear sense of what he was willing to do to acquire what he wanted. He'd seen Helix Systems in 2005 and understood immediately what Walter had built. Not just a product, a market position. A decade ahead of the regulatory environment that was coming, the one that would make cybersecurity infrastructure not optional but legally mandatory for every financial institution in the country. Walter had built the thing that would be worth not $68 million, but $600 million, possibly more, if someone patient and well-connected handled the next 5 years correctly. Douglas Hale was patient. He was well-connected, and he had very specific ideas about who should be handling those next 5 years. The acquisition conversation started as a partnership conversation. Arcturus would provide growth capital. Walter would retain operational control. The terms were documented in a term sheet that ran 47 pages. Walter had a lawyer review it. A good lawyer. A Howard Law graduate named Patricia Osai, who had done M&A work for a decade. Patricia told him the terms were aggressive, but not unusual. She flagged 3 clauses. Walter negotiated 2 of them down. The third, a governance provision that gave Arcturus board appointment rights in the event of a material operational disruption, he accepted. Because Douglas assured him over dinner at a restaurant Walter had never heard of that cost $400 a plate, that it was standard language. Boilerplate. Nothing to worry about. He should have worried. The material operational disruption was manufactured. Walter saw it later, all of it, in documents he wasn't supposed to survive long enough to obtain. A client complaint seated by an Arcturus-connected law firm about a security breach that had never occurred. A regulatory inquiry triggered by an anonymous tip to the SEC. Two of Helix's largest bank clients quietly pressured to pause their contracts, creating a revenue gap that showed up on the quarterly report as a 22% decline. Each event, in isolation, was explicable. Together, they constituted the material operational disruption that gave Douglas Hale's board appointees the governance rights to remove Walter Gaines as CEO. He was removed on a Tuesday in March 2008. Escorted from the building he had built, his 51% stake, under terms he had signed, and which Patricia Osei had flagged, but not flagged loudly enough, was subject to a forced buyout clause triggered by the same governance event. He received $4 million for a company that sold, 14 months later, to a defense contractor for $480 million. He tried to fight it. Of course he did. He hired lawyers. He filed complaints. The SEC inquiry was quietly closed. No finding, no explanation. The client complaints were settled under ENDA. The law firm that had seeded the original complaint had no discoverable connection to Arcturus. Patricia Osei worked the case for 2 years on reduced fees because she believed him. The courts did not find sufficient evidence. By 2011, Walter Gaines had spent $3 million of his $4 million in legal fees. He had no company. He had no case. He had a daughter in high school and a mortgage he could no longer service, and a reputation in the industry that had been carefully, systematically poisoned. There was a specific afternoon he returned to in his mind often in the years that followed. October 2010. He was sitting in Patricia's conference room after a hearing had gone wrong, a motion denied, a judge who'd looked at him with the particular neutrality that is its own kind of verdict, and Patricia had set down her pen and said, "Walter, tell me something I haven't found yet. Tell me there's something they missed." And Walter had looked at the table and said, "I don't know. I was inside it. I trusted the people around me. I didn't document the way I should have." He'd paused. "Then, I'll never make that mistake again." Patricia had looked at him for a long moment. She didn't know then what he meant. She would understand later. He lost the house in 2012. He and Cassia moved into the Newark apartment, 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, a kitchen window that looked onto an air shaft. Cassia was 17. She was old enough to understand what had happened, and young enough to be furious about it in the uncomplicated, clarifying way of teenagers who have not yet learned to manage their anger into something socially acceptable. She was furious at Douglas Hale, which was correct. She was furious at the lawyers and the judges and the system, which was also correct. And some nights she was furious at her father, which was the most painful correctness of all. The anger of a child who had watched her parent be destroyed and needed somewhere to put it. Walter let her be angry. He didn't defend himself, and he didn't fall apart. He cooked dinner. He helped with her homework. He applied for work. He worked in it consulting through 2013 and 2014. Smaller and smaller contracts, as Arcturus's network of influence proved wider than he'd mapped. Douglas Hale never threatened him directly. He never had to. The industry simply became unavailable. Doors didn't close dramatically. They just weren't open when Walter knocked. A contract would be moving forward, and then a call would come saying the client had decided to go another direction. An introduction would be warm, and then the follow-up would go unanswered. It happened too consistently to be coincidence, and too quietly to be actionable. He took the janitor job at Arcturus Capital in January 2015. His daughter Kezia thought he had lost his mind. She was 22, finishing her MBA, and she sat across from him at his kitchen table in the Newark apartment and said, "Dad, you cannot clean their floors." Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not cleaning their floors. She didn't understand yet. She would. The thing about being a janitor in a building full of powerful people who have decided you don't exist is that you become genuinely invisible. Not metaphorically invisible. Actually invisible. Walter moved through Arcturus Capital's offices for 3 years, emptying trash cans and replacing toner cartridges and buffing the floors of the 40th floor boardroom after the monthly board meetings. And in that time, not a single board member learned his name. Not Douglas Hale, who passed him in the hallway every Tuesday morning and had never, not once, made eye contact. Not CFO Martin Chu, who once asked Walter, looking at a spot approximately 6 inches above his head, to make sure the coffee station was restocked before the 9 a.m. They saw a uniform. They saw a mop. They did not see Walter Gaines. The first month, he oriented himself, learned the rhythms of the building the way he had once learned the rhythms of a new server architecture, where the load concentrated, where the gaps were, which systems talked to which. Board meetings, third Thursday of every month, 8 a.m. to noon on the 40th floor. Douglas Hale arrived at 7:15 every morning, left at 7:45 every evening, never varied by more than 4 minutes in either direction. The executive floor was cleaned between 6 and 7 p.m. after the last assistants left, but before the cleaning crew's second pass at 10. That 2-hour window when the offices sat empty and the doors were unlocked for cleaning, that was the window Walter was interested in. The second month, he started paying attention to the trash. Not the secure shredder output, that was gone, properly destroyed, no use to anyone, but the ordinary recycling bins beside the printers, where drafts went, where the first version of a memo went before someone decided it was too direct and rewrote it, where the printout of an email chain went after someone read it standing at the machine and tossed it, because they never thought about where things went after they were discarded. People threw away extraordinary things when they believed no one was watching. By the 4th month, he'd found the first thread, a draft term sheet, not for Helix, for a different acquisition, that contained the same governance language Patricia had flagged in his own contract. Identical phrasing. Boilerplate, Douglas had said. It wasn't boilerplate. It was a template. A mechanism Arcturus used consistently, deliberately, across multiple deals to acquire controlling rights through manufactured crisis rather than negotiation. Walter photographed it with the phone he kept in his breast pocket, beneath the uniform with the logo on it. He filed it. He kept going. Every Tuesday, and he buffed the hallway outside Douglas Hale's office between 6:15 and 6:45 p.m. Long enough to hear the end of calls Douglas didn't bother lowering his voice for, because who was going to hear the janitor? Walter didn't need to hear much. A name here. A figure there. A reference to a timeline that matched something in the draft documents. The picture was assembling itself one shard at a time, and Walter had learned, in the years of legal defeat, in the years of watching an industry close around him like water over a dropped stone, that patience was not passive. Patience was the most aggressive strategy available to someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to document. The whiteboards were the most valuable. Executive teams used whiteboards to think out loud, and they were erased but rarely photographed before erasing, and the cleaning crew came through after the erase. Except that dry erase markers leave a ghost. A faint impression in the board surface, if you know how to look, how to angle the light. Walter knew how to look. He had taken a photograph of a whiteboard in the CFO's office in month 7 that showed, ghosted and partial, but legible to someone who'd spent months building context. A cash flow diagram with Helix Systems' old revenue numbers mapped against Arcturus's acquisition cost and projected sale price. with a date. The date was 3 weeks before the SEC inquiry that had triggered Walter's removal. He had held that photograph on his phone in the elevator, going down to the parking level that night, alone, and he had not allowed himself to feel anything. Not yet. There was more to find. He kept going. They did not see Walter Gaines, who had spent 3 years using the access that invisibility provided to reconstruct, piece by piece, everything that had been done to him. The documents were not dramatic to obtain. That was the thing no one told you about corporate fraud. It wasn't hidden in a vault. It was hidden in plain sight, in the discarded printouts and carelessly tossed draft memos and the whiteboards people forgot to erase because they'd assumed the cleaning crew wouldn't know what they were looking at. Walter photographed whiteboards. He retrieved shredder bags, not from the secure shredder, which was properly used for sensitive documents, but from the ordinary trash, where drafts and early-stage correspondence went because people didn't think. He cross-referenced names and dates against public filings. He rebuilt the picture. It took 38 months. By October 2017, he had what Patricia O'Say, now working the case for free because she'd never stopped believing him, called the most thoroughly documented case of coordinated securities fraud she had seen in 20 years of practice. The envelope he placed on the boardroom table that morning contained one item: a letter informing Douglas Hale and the board of Arcturus Capital that a sealed complaint had been filed with the SEC, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the State Attorney General's office the previous evening, before Walter arrived for his shift, documenting 14 counts of securities fraud, market manipulation, and tortious interference spanning the period 2007 to 2009. The letter further informed the board that copies of all supporting documentation had been provided to 3 investigative journalists, 2 of whom were already working the story, with publication scheduled regardless of any legal action Arcturus might attempt. And then it informed them that Walter Gaines, currently employed as a custodian on the facilities staff of Arcturus Capital, was the complainant. Martin Chu, the CFO, was the first to place him. You could see it happen, the slow, terrible recognition crossing his face as he looked at the man in the uniform with the Arcturus logo on the breast pocket, and understood that he had walked past this man 1,000 times in 3 years. That he had spoken to this man about coffee restocking, that this man had been in this boardroom, had been in every room. Douglas Hale did not go pale the way the others went pale. He went still. The particular stillness of a man whose entire operating model, his read on people, his certainty about who mattered and who didn't, his lifelong confidence that the world sorted itself correctly, had just been handed back to him in an envelope. The board members looked at each other, looked at the letter, looked at the man in the uniform. Somewhere in the room, someone's chair scraped back slightly, the involuntary recoil of a body responding before the mind caught up. Martin Chu had gone a specific gray color that Walter recognized from his years watching cardiac monitors, the color of a system under sudden, severe stress. 2 of the outside board members, men Walter had seen in this room a dozen times, men whose names he knew from SEC filings and whose conversations he'd overheard in fragments over 3 years, were already reaching for their phones, their lawyers, their crisis PR teams, the machinery of powerful men protecting themselves, spinning up. Douglas looked at Walter Gaines for what was possibly the first time. Really looked. And Walter looked back at him with an expression that contained no anger, no triumph, and no request for anything at all. Just the steady attention of a man who had waited 9 years for this exact moment and had learned, in the waiting, to need nothing from it, except its occurrence. "You've been here," Douglas said. Not a question. 3 years, Walter said. "Good morning, Mr. Hale." The silence stretched. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city went about its Tuesday morning, 40 stories down, indifferent and unaware. "This is a mistake," Douglas said. Finally, his voice, he was trying to find the frame, the angle, the leverage point, the move. A lifetime of making rooms rearrange themselves around his certainty, and now he was reaching for the next play and finding the board empty. "You have no idea what you're alleging. The legal exposure alone has been reviewed by 3 firms and a former federal prosecutor," Walters said. "Since 2000, while I was buffing your floors." Another pause. "The complaint was filed yesterday at 4 p.m. Copies of the documentation went to the journalists at 4:15. One of them called your communications director at 6 this morning. He looked around the table, measured and unhurried. I assume that's why you're all here an hour early." The room confirmed it. The early arrival. The tight faces. They'd known something was moving toward them. They hadn't known what, or from where. They had looked at every conceivable threat, competitors, regulators, former partners. The journalist they'd known was sniffing around the 2009 Helix acquisition, and they had not looked at the man emptying their trash cans. Martin Chu set down his phone. He looked at Walter with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. "The whiteboards," he said very quietly. It wasn't a question either. Walter said nothing. "We erased them." "Dry erase leaves a ghost," Walter said. "You have to photograph before you erase." "No one told you that?" Martin Chu closed his eyes. Douglas Hale said, "I'll have my lawyers call your lawyers within the hour." "Patricia Osei," Walter said. "She's been waiting for that call for 9 years." He picked up the envelope, empty now, its single item delivered, and he stood. He smoothed the front of his uniform. The logo caught the light. Arcturus Capital, the same gold threading on every floor of this building, on every piece of letterhead, on the documents in front of every man in this room. He'd worn it for 3 years. It had made him invisible. Now it made him something else entirely. "Have a good morning, gentlemen," Walter said. And he walked back out the mahogany doors the way he'd come in. The SEC investigation ran 14 months. Douglas Hale's legal team was formidable and expensive, and they fought every step. But the documentation Walter had assembled, supplemented by 2 former Arcturus employees who came forward once the complaint was public, emboldened by what Patricia called the avalanche effect of watching the first stone fall, proved durable. In the end, the charges that stuck were 4 counts of securities fraud and 2 counts of wire fraud. Douglas Hale, 78 years old by the time sentencing came, received a fine of $230 million and 3 years of supervised release. His age and health precluded prison, which some found unsatisfying and others called proportional. Martin Chu, younger and more directly implicated in the operational mechanics, received 18 months in a minimum security facility and a permanent bar from the securities industry. Arcturus Capital dissolved during the investigation. Its remaining portfolio companies sold off or transferred. The $480 million that Helix Systems had sold for in 2009 was long since dispersed, but the civil judgment pursued simultaneously by Patricia Osei in a wrongful acquisition case that was now, with the criminal findings as foundation, straightforward, resulted in a settlement of $61 million paid to Walter Gaines over 5 years. He did not buy a large house. He did not buy a car he'd seen in a magazine. He called Kessia, who was running her own strategy consultancy by then, and he said, "I need your help with something." 18 months after the settlement, the Gaines Foundation launched its first cohort, 12 black engineers and entrepreneurs, ages 25 to 35, each receiving $200,000 in no-strings funding and 2 years of legal, financial, and operational support to build their companies without the vulnerabilities that had been used to dismantle his. The application required one essay. The prompt was a single question. What did you build? And what did someone try to take? In the first year, they received 4,000 applications. Walter Gaines did not give many interviews. When he did, he declined to describe what he had done at Arcturus as revenge, or justice, or even vindication. Reporters kept reaching for those words, and he kept setting them aside. In the one long profile he allowed, a magazine piece published 2 years after the settlement, he said this: "I didn't go back there to destroy anything. I went back because the evidence was there. I was the only person who could get it. I happened to be in the building." A pause. That's the thing about being invisible. It only works if the other person thinks it does. He still had the janitor's uniform. His daughter had asked him to throw it away. He kept it folded on a shelf in his office at the foundation, next to his degree from Howard and a photograph of the Helix Systems staff from 2007. 212 people standing outside the Baltimore building, where they'd outgrown the apartment. Every person who came to the foundation for the first time, every young founder, every lawyer, every mentor, saw it there. Nobody who saw it asked what it was for. They all understood. Some things you keep not as trophies, but as reminders of exactly how much can be survived and what it costs and what it's worth.